We're on Daf Mem Vav, and we're up to the Mishnah on the bottom of the Daf. Kesad mafrishin chala b'tuma. So the case is you have a dough, and the dough contracted tuma, and the yontif. Now the yontif here is Pesach, and it means he has to bake it on Pesach. The reason why he has to bake it is because in its present state as an isa, as a dough, if you don't arrest the fermentation process by baking it, then inevitably it's going to become chametz. When you leave an isa, as we established in the previous sugya earlier on this amud, that was left for a period of, let's call it 18 minutes without kneading the dough, then it becomes chametz, and then he violates 2 lavim of bal yirah b'motzei. So now we have a problem. We don't know what to do with this challah situation, which has contracted tumah. Normally, we would say that baking on yontif is permissible, and that would certainly solve the problem of the chimutz and bal yirah b'motzei. But in our case, baking is not an option. Now, why isn't baking an option? And the answer is because if the challah became tmeya, then it doesn't come under the law of ochel nefesh. Normally, the Torah says with regard to malach on yontif that achar sheyochel l'chol nefesh hu yeyasa lechem, we're allowed to do malacha for the sake of ochel nefesh. But the status of challah tmeya is such that it has to be burnt and it cannot be eaten, not by a Kohen and not by Yisrael. Yisrael can't eat it even if it's challah tahora. But in the case of challah tmeya, even a Kohen can't eat it. So if you have challah tahora, you could bake it on behalf of a Kohen, and even if you don't have a Kohen in your house on Yontif, you can always guess that maybe a Kohen would show up, so that makes it ochel nefesh. But when you have something that's prohibited to everybody, it's prohibited to a non-Kohen because it's challah, and it's prohibited to a Kohen because it's tmeya, no one could eat it, then there's no heter whatsoever of ochel nefesh. And even according to Beis Hillel, who hold mitoch, which is a famous sugi of Beitza, that mitoch shehutra litzorach hutra nami shelo litzorach, but it has to be at least litzorach hayom. It has to be something that you can benefit from on the day of Yontif. In this case, what benefit can you get from challah tmeya on Yontif? So you're really in a bind. You cannot leave it as is because it'll become chametz. You cannot bake it because there's no heter for afi on yontif if it's shelo litzar klal, because it's challah tmeya. Now, perhaps we could say the following, that even if he cannot bake it now on yontif, why not leave the dough as is till Motzei Yontif and then burn the dough as you would normally burn challah tmeya? But the answer is, as we said before, because in the interim, until Motzei Yontif, it's going to rise, it's going to become chametz, and you'll be violating during Yontif the Easter of bal yirah b'motzei. Now, let's add another element into the equation. Would you be allowed to take challah tmeya and feed it to a dog? Let's say the Kohen has a dog. He'll feed his challah tmeya to a dog. And why can't he do that? In other words, although you might say it's not litzorech ochel nefesh in the strict sense, because the Kohen is not allowed to eat this challah tmeya, but since he's allowed to feed it to his dog, then we could leave it as is, and we can burn it. Let's just see. If we leave it as is, it becomes chametz. So we don't want to leave it as is because if it becomes chametz, we have a problem by Yerah by Motzei. But on the other hand, what we could do is bake it and feed it to the Kohen, to the Kohen's kelev, to the kelev shel Kohen. Oh, that too is prohibited. And this is based on the Marshal's interpretation of Rashi, and the Ran says it pretty explicitly. That if you to feed challah tmeah to a kelev on Yontif, that would be a violation of what's called biur chametz. What does that mean? So this is based on a Gemara Masechta Shabbos. The Gemara darshins on Daf Chav Daled a pasuk lo sasiru menu ad boker anosim menu ad boker ba'esh tisaref, and the Torah says ad boker twice in the same pasuk, and the Gemara says lama nichtav pam shnia ad boker liten lem boker sheni l'srei fasol, which means that let's say you have kodshim that became tamei. And the din is that kodshim tmeim have to be burnt. The pasuk is teaching us that on Yontif itself, that's the first boker, when it became nosar, let's say, or tamei, you cannot burn it, but you have to wait till the next boker, which is chol hamoed. So why can't you burn this kodshim tmeim or kodshim shenifsalu, or kodshim that became nosar? Why can't you burn it on Yontif? And the answer is the Torah says that whenever you have to destroy something, that biur is prohibited on Yontif. In other words, the mitzvah of biur elevates this burning process to a special status, and ein sarfim kodshim b'yontif. And therefore, there's no way that we can burn this truma, this challah tmeah on Yontif. We can't bake it because, as we said before, it's an afir shalol l'tzarech ochel nefesh. We can't burn it because then it becomes sreifas ki'ilu kodshim b'yontif. In other words, whenever there's a mitzvah of sreifa or biur, then it's prohibited on Yontif. If, on the other hand, we can't bake it and we can't burn it, and we want to leave it as is, now it becomes chametz, and he violates by Yerah by Matzah. And the Mishnah is going to present three different opinions as to what you do in this predicament. Now, the Shagas Aryeh is famous for asking the following question on the Mishnah: what's the big deal? Why doesn't he just do bittul? And if he's mevatel his challah, if he's mafkir and he makes it into hefker, then he doesn't violate by Yerah by Matzah. It's not his shel chayat haroah, avlat haroah shel acherim or shel hefker. And the Shagas Aryeh gives a pretty exciting answer. He says that hefker will not work, is not operative with regard to challah. And why is that? Because challah doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the kohen. You have the right to decide which kohen you want to give it to, which is called Tofas Hano. We'll discuss that in the Gemara. But nevertheless, you don't have full ownership. And therefore, if let's say you would take this challah and you would give it to a woman and say, Areat Mekudeshes li, he would not be able to effectuate Kedushin. It's not his. And so too, he cannot be mevatel it, because he can only be mevatel that which is yours. So getting back to our original question, we have here challah tmeah. It's about to become chametz. We got to arrest that process very quickly. What are we going to do with it? We cannot bake it because that would be an afir shalol l'tzarech ochel nefesh. We cannot burn it because that would be sreifas kodshim b'yontif, which is also prohibited. And we don't have really what would seem any option over here, because his dough became an isa tmeah, which he cannot bake on Yontif. And even if he would, the Kohen, let's say, would feed the challah to his dog, that also is an act of bir chametz, which is prohibited on Yom Tov. But given all these problems, what do we do? Now, the Mishnah's language is interesting. It says, Ketzad mafrishim. And the implication of the Mishnah is that he's already chayav in challah, which is called gilgul isa. In other words, the moment he kneads the dough, after he pours the water into the flour, that dough generates a mitzvah of challah, which is called reishis harisol sechem. And now he has to be mafresh challah. The Mishnah seems to imply that if, let's say, he had only flour, but he hasn't yet poured the water into the flour, that's before Gilgul Isa, where you would not ask the question, Ketzad mafrishin, then you have no problem. If that be the case, then comes along Rabbeinu David, he's the Talmud Muvhak of the Ramban, and he says the following: if the kemach is tamei, then I have a solution to this problem. He could have avoided the whole predicament, assuming the kemach became tamei. What could he have done? He could have separated the kemach into small portions, split the kemach into segments, added the water, and he could have kneaded the dough, and it's what's called pachos mikishir challah. Our Mishnah is addressing a case where he already kneaded the dough, and it has tumah, it's challah tmeis, chayav and challah, ketzad mafrishin, and he's chayav and challah. That's why he has this problem here. What's he going to do with challah? He can't bake it, he can't leave it. But let's say he hadn't been chayav in challah. Says Rabbeinu David, why wasn't he chayav in challah yet? Because he hasn't added the mayin. He's got kemach, and although the kemach is tamei, he could add the mayin, and he could then bake the dough. How? Says Rabbeinu David, by splitting the flour into smaller portions, which is less than the shir challah. Interesting innovation here, which he could have circumvented the entire problem. Okay, that's not a kasha per se. That's just Rabbeinu David's comment that the Mishnah is saying Ketzad mafrishin to tell me that kvarnis galgala ha'isa. He already has a kneaded dough. He's already added the water, and now he's chayav in chal. He can't undermine or prevent the chiyuv chal from being chal because it's already too late. Says Rabbeinu David a shtickle Torah that if this chacham would have asked us the question in advance before he added the water, when he had kemach tamei, we would have recommended to him that he circumvent the entire chiyuv challah by separating smaller volumes of kemach, such that he doesn't have the shir challah. Then he's not chayav in challah, and then he could bake his bread, no problem. It's not a meleches batola, it's a meleches ochel nefesh, because he can eat these small challahs. Again, under normal circumstances, we would not necessarily recommend that you split your kemach in such a way that it's less than your challah, you won't be chayav with challah. But given the fact that he's faced with such an issue of an isra afiyah if it's chayav and challah, and on the other hand, he can't leave it without afiyah because it'll become chametz. So under those circumstances, we'll certainly recommend that he simply avoid the chiyuv challah. That's what Rabbeinu David says. Comes along the tshuva me'ava, which if I would move my screen a little bit to the left, you'd see it. I have it here, the tshuva me'ava. His name was Fleshman. He was a rav in Austria-Hungary, that part. Anyway, he asks the following question. Minat Torah, according to Torah law, you're chayav in challah even on Pachos Bikazayis. It was the Rabbanon who instituted the shear of, let's say, 1/24. There's, Mida Beinanis, Mida Tova, Ayin Tova, and Ayin Ra, and so forth and so on. And he says the following. He says, Minat Torah, he could be mafresh chala from Pachos Mikashir. The Torah says that Chatzi Shir also Minat Torah. And therefore, even if you were to take up the Rabbi David on his offer, so to speak, his recommendation, and you were to separate the kemach into smaller segments, you'd still have a mitzvah of hafrashas chala midoraisa, even in smaller segments. It sounds like Rabbi David is assuming that you can completely ignore the mitzvah of chala by dividing the kemach in its volume, in its large volume, into smaller volumes of kemach. So the Tshuva Mi'ava claims that the Tanav Mishnah wanted to find an Eitzah to avoid even an Iser of Chatzi Shir, meaning that even if he has less than the full Shir, and the Torah recognizes his Hafrashas Chala, but nevertheless, once there is Hafrashas Chala, then he's back to his same predicament. Now the Tshuva Mi'ava asks the following question, very fascinating question. If Rabbeinu David would advocate that he could avoid the problem by separating the challah to smaller pockets, smaller bags, and then add the water, well, in that case, maybe he doesn't have to bake it at all. Rabbeinu David is trying to achieve the goal that he's not chayiv in hafrashas challah because he doesn't have a shir challah, and then there's no problem in baking it. The Tshuva Mi'ava wants to go a step further and say, forget about baking it. Just leave it as it is. If you leave it as it is without baking, it's going to become chametz. But he's got pachos mikashir, he has small amounts. And the minimal share of chametz is a kezayis. If he has less than a kezayis, then he doesn't violate Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh. Comes all in Tshuva Mi'ava, and he says, no. Just like in Achila, if you would eat chametz, if you ate less than a kezayis, you violate the principle of Chatzi Shir Asr Torah. That principle applies even with regard to Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh, such that if you have a Chatzi Zayis in your possession, you violate Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh. Rabbi Akiva Eiger has a lot of problems with this. It doesn't seem to be an Iser of Chatzi Shir with regard to Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh. In regard to Ochel, so the Gemara at the end of Yoma gives various svaras. Maybe it's not a full-fledged achila, but it is a potential achila. That's fine. But with regard to bailus on chametz, when the Torah prohibits that under 2 lavim Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh, that requires a kezayis. In fact, if you recall, this is one of Rabbi Akiva Eiger's rayas, the sugya that we had the other day of the batzek that got trapped in the crevices of the kneading bowl, we saw that if it was less than a kezayis, it doesn't have chashivus, and he's not chayiv in biyur. So this premise that Chatzi Shir Asam and Torah would apply not only to Machalas Asuros, to Isra Akilu, but also to Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh, is a very iffy, questionable premise. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, Ein Isra Bal Yirah Bechatzi Shir. And therefore, what he can do is he can be mafresh chala of Chatzi Shir. And that becomes a viable option, because after he's mafresh chala on Chatzi Shir, he can leave the dough as is, Again, afia is a problem, but let him leave the dough as is, and he won't violate bal yiroi by matzeh because ein iser bal yiroi by matzeh b'chatzi shi. So let's go through the three possible recommendations to avoid this predicament, to solve this predicament. First is Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Lo tikra l'Hashem ad shetei ofer. He's already chayav chala. As we said before, there was already Gilgal Isa. However, he doesn't have to be mafresh chala immediately. He can postpone afrashas chala. And in this case, he should bake it before he was mafresh the chala. What does that mean? What does he gain by that? He says that at the moment that he bakes it, every part of this dough is mutar b'achila. It's edible. And why is it edible? Because he wasn't yet korei shem chala. At this point, it's no different than baking any bread. It's royal achila. And therefore it comes under ochel nefesh, and that afiyah should be mutar. And we're going to see now that Ben Beseira is going to present a different solution to this problem. But the Achronim are very interested to know, why did Ben Beseira feel compelled to offer an alternative solution? Why not implement Rabbi Eliezer's solution, which seems so simple? You're telling me, well, it's going to become chametz. He can't make it because it's challah, and it's not even challah tahora. It's challah tmeya, such that even the kohen can't eat it. There's no heter meleches ochel nefesh. Why not just do the afiyah before the Kriyas Shem? In which case, at this point, it's not challah. It's chulin, which every single one of us could eat, even if it's tameh. Once you have the afiyah, now you chayv in challah, and you will be mafresh challah, but there's no chametz issue. So what bothers Ben Beseira? The Ritva and the Meiri come up with a theory as to why Ben Beseira will deviate from Rabbi Eliezer and offer an alternative solution. L'das Rabbi Eliezer, ein lefos tchila es kol hakikros. We cannot bake all these different breads from the Isa that is contracted tumah. The kevon the omed lahafrish achas mehem l'truma, meaning l'chala. One of them he has to be mafresh as chala. The al yidei te oser ba'achila. We know that the only way he can allow himself to eat all these kikros after he bakes them is by being mafresh one kikar or whatever it is as chala. Then vis-a-vis that one kikar, which he designates as chala, that kikar is aser b'achila. Why? Because it's chala tmeya. I mean, if you're a zar, you can't eat it. If you're a kohen, you can't eat it. Nimtza sha'af with a mapik hey shalol itzarch yont. Are you with me, Rabbosai? There's a problem here, according to Ben Beseira, with Rabbi Eliezer's recommendation, because we know that in order for his afiyah to be considered afiyah of ochel nefesh, at some point down the line, he's going to have to be mafresh challah. Otherwise, his afiyah is shalol tzorchel nefesh because he's not allowed to eat any of the challahs. They're all teva. Now, with regard to that one particular portion, we'll call it a challah, that's going to be designated as challah, there was no afil etzarech yontif. Why? Because challah tmeya cannot be eaten by anybody. So you'll tell me, well, I can justify the afiyah based on all the other kikros. Correct? That's Rabbi Eliezer's position. But Ben Sarah understood, so says the Meiri, that I have to have a heter afiyah for every single kikar. Now, again, you may say, well, maybe he'll put the whole dough in the oven and then he'll cut it up into pieces later on. The Meiri is assuming, we don't know why yet, that according to Rabbi Eliezer's solution, you now are baking individual portions. You haven't yet decided which of those small challahs will be designated as challah. And therefore, since you don't know, sometimes ignorance is bliss, you can always say vis-a-vis each one of the challahs that that's going to be the one I'm going to eat. That's not going to be the one I'm mafresh as challah. And therefore, vis-a-vis each one of these individual kikros, I can have an afil etzorah. Comes along Ben Beseir and he says, "Who are you fooling? You know, it's very nice to have an ostrich, with your head in the ground, but you know for sure that one of these kikros, undefined at this point, as you put into the oven, is going to be the one that's ultimately designated as challah. And since it's challah tmei, it cannot be eaten. And you're doing an afiyah for that particular isa, that particular dough, which is shalol litzarech yantif. B'nimtza sha'afa b'yantif shalol litzarech. Again, he's assuming you have many, many kikros. I don't know how he knows that. I mean, does the Mishnah say that he has many different kikros? I don't know.
You can be marbe b'seuda on yontif. Why can't be you be marbe and then kikros?
Correct, but you can't be marbe Su'uda unless it's mutter to eat that Su'uda, meaning I can always say the Orchim are going to show up, right? So I'm going to bake as much as I can, but I can only bake something that's heter. And with regard to one of these kikros, undefined at this point, it cannot be mutter because it's again Isa Shenitma. So when it becomes challah, after you designate as challah, it's challah tmeya. Challah tmeya is nitan l'sreifa, but you can't bake it. If I would have known, if he would have been mafresh challah before afiyah, which is usually what we do, then he cannot bake that particular challah. Then the Gemara says we're back to square one, because if he doesn't bake that particular kikar, that particular isa, it becomes chavetz, and then he violates val yirah b'yamatzah. So he's got to bake every last kikar. So Rabbi Elazar says I can circumvent this problem by not baking after the hafrasha, so that at this point, machnish visidik, as we say, every single kikar seems like a, I'm tar v'kadosh, I'm the chulin, I'm not the truma, and therefore I can be eaten. But who you fooling, says Ben Beseira. You know that one of those kikros that you're baking, you will specify as challah, and it's challah tmeya, which cannot be eaten. So you're doing an afiyah on challah tmeya. Let me just read another line here.
Very far-fetched.
He says, V'af, even if daito lito prusa mikol kikar v'kikar. Okay, for this we have to know more of, of the mitzvah of challah and the, Masechta challah. Well, let's say his das, for whatever reason, we're gonna be ignorant now, is to be mafresh a little bit from each one of the kikros. But he says, nevertheless, that itself is not a problem. Why? Because rove of each kikar is nefel etzorech. Again, Ben Beseira would not have a problem if his das was to be mafresh from each one of the kikros, because since when he puts the kikar, each one individually, into the oven, rove of that kikar is litzorech, and that's enough. But if you have one full kikar that's going to be designated, instead of taking a little piece from each one of the kikros, he decides, for whatever reason, I mean, again, we may have to study Hilchas Challah for this, but he decides that one of the kikros is going to be designated as Challah, then he did a separate afiyah on that kikar at a Shalol Tzara. He says, Kevan sheyochol mitol Challah kodem she'ofes hakikros, Areu bichlal ofes Shalol Tzara. Wow, this is already a tremendous chiddush. He's saying that according to Ben Beseira, even if he could resolve the problem the way Rabbi Eliezer suggested it, by being mafresh from each prusa, ma'at, but nevertheless, he could have decided to be mafresh an entire challah. And that alone is enough to say that this afiyah is shalol tzarech, according to Ben Beseira. Pillei plan, this meiri. I'll go over it one more time. The meiri just defies our comprehension. The meiri admits that Ben Beseira would have no problem in baking this unassigned challah on Yom Tov, if only the unassigned challah is not one separate kikar, but rather pieces of each one of the kikros. Ben Beseira theoretically would have no problem with that. But Ben Beseira's problem is that even if his intention is to take off a small amount from each one of the kikros, since he could have, theoretically, baked each one of the kikros as chulin and then be mafresh one kikar as challah, that itself engenders an afiyah shalol tzar. And here I admit I plead the fifth, as we say. It doesn't make any sense. In a case where he designates one full challah, okay, so then, it's a toss-up between Rabbi Eliezer and Ben Beseira. You could say, well, it was unassigned when he did the afiyah, and therefore each one could have potentially been litzorech. And Ben Beseira says, no, l'mafreya, now we see that this kikar was challah, and who allowed you to bake the kikar? That I understand. But now the meiri is saying that on a conceptual level, Ben Beseira would have no problem if you be mafresh ma'at from each one of the kikros, because then we have a loch of rov, and the rov of each kikar was litzorech, because it was chulin and not challah. What should be the problem in that case? Meaning, that's what Ben Beseira should be on board to advocate that solution, accepting, according to the meiri, as the meiri understands Ben Beseira, that principle, that if rov of the kikar is litzorech, that's enough to be matir the afiyah on that kikar. Comes along the meiri with a gevaldige chiddush. It's a very intriguing idea that since in the constellation of Hafrashas Challah, he has two options. He can either be Mafresh Challah from each one of the kikros, or he has what's called Siruf Kli, right? He has all these different little kikros on the same shulchan, and therefore he can designate one kikar as Challah for all the rest of them. Why should he go through the hassle of having to take off Challah from each one of these 10 little kikros? Let him just designate, 9 will be chulin and 1 will be challah. And the very fact that he could do so makes the afiyah into an afiyah. In other words, what Ben Beseira is saying is, let's look at the scenario, look at the situation as he's putting in the 10 kikros into the oven. Rabbi Eliezer says, let's look at it from his mindset. What is his intention? His intention is to be mafresh challah from each one of the 10 kikros. A ma'at. Comes along Ben Beseira and he says, forget about his intention. I don't care about his intention. Let's look at the objective ma'asafiyah. He's got 10 kikros. And what do you do when you have 10 kikros? You take one of them and designate it as challah. You know, wrap it up in a beautiful wrapping and bring it to the kohen. Well, what are you gonna bring to the kohen? Little pieces? You could. Anyway, that's just a fascinating presentation of the Meiri. Now, Tosfos goes on to say that we're about to learn Ben Beseira, and you should know that Rabbi Eliezer would also accept Ben Beseira. So it's a one-way affair. Ben Beseira, what we saw in the Meiri and the Ritva, rejects Rabbi Eliezer, as we tried to explain, but Rabbi Eliezer would not object to Ben Beseira. And then the Rishonim are going to say that the reason why Rabbi Eliezer did not offer the recommendation of Ben Beseira is because it's not something that's so reliable. It's a little sticky. You know, he may succeed, he may not succeed. You know, you tell him to do something, you have to be pretty sure and guaranteed that he'll do it the right way. Ben Beseira Omer, Hatil Bitzone. Let him take this Isa and let him freeze it, so to speak. Throw it into a pail of cold water, which will arrest the process of chimus. After Yontiv, then he'll deal with it. He hasn't violated by Rabbi Motzi. It never became chametz. He froze the dough as is. And after Yontif is over, he'll be mafresh challah. That challah will go to the ovens. That'll be burnt to crisp because it's challah tmeya. And the balance will be kulin tmeim, which we're allowed to eat. So there's no problem. Your whole rush and your urgency to bake it was because of Bali Rabbi Motzei. I can avoid that Bali Rabbi Motzei problem of chimutz by simply, I call it freezing the dough. And here, Tosfos says that Rabbi Eliezer would agree to Ben Beseira's recommendation, and certainly Atolas Isa B'Tzonei and Shelo Tachmitz would be fine, but Roy Yoser Linog B'Derech Acheretz Tichoshishin Shema Lo Yizor Yofe Sheyu Hamayim Tzonenim V'Yavo Lidei Chibutz. If you won't be very careful about the temperature of the Mayim Tzonenim, so I'm guessing, again, I don't know the physics of it, but that it's not what we call room temperature. That enough would not arrest the process of chimutz. You need really extra cold water. I don't know what degree. And Rabbi Eliezer did not want to advocate such a recommendation. It's not reliable. That it'll actually, but we have to worry that maybe he won't succeed in implementing this recommendation and take the dough and put it into very cold water and arrest the process of chimutz. The Rav Shulchan Aruch, the other day was Yat Kislev. I'm on Shabbos, right? So the Shulchan Aruch Rav says, based on this Tosfos, that Halacha L'Maisa Rabbi Eliezer would agree that if he went ahead, he was mafresh challah before the afiyah, which again he could have done. Again, Rabbi Eliezer tells him not to do that, but if he did that, then what you would do is take this dough and freeze it, even according to Rabbi Eliezer. And now we turn to Daf Mem Vav Amud Beis, and we get to the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yeshua is going to assume that he went ahead and he was mafresh challah. Now, if he was mafresh challah, we said that he has no possibility of afiyah vis-a-vis that challah, because that challah is tmeya, and you can't bake challah tmeya on Yom Tov. So what's going to happen? That challah is going to become chametz. Says Rabbi Yehuda, so what? What do I care? There's no Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh on challah. Why? Lo zehu chametz shemutharim olav b'Bal Yirah u'Bal Yimatzeh. Ela mafrisho menicha erev v'mechmitza chmitza. The whole Mishnah is just totally superfluous. There's no predicament here whatsoever. The whole Ganzen business, what motivated Rabbi Lezer and said to come up with each one is because we're afraid to leave it without baking. How can we allow the baking on Yontif? It's Shalol Tzorech. And Rabbi Lezer says, you know what? Don't be an Ibra Chacham and be Mafresh Challah. Just put it all into the oven because you don't know which is going to be Challah. And Rabbi Ben Beseir says, you know what? Let's freeze the whole thing so it doesn't become Chametz. Come to Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, there's no Bali Rabbi Yamatze over here. Leave well enough alone and deal with it after Yontif. And even if it becomes Chametz, there's no Bali Rabbi Yamatze. So Rashi explains, why is there no Bali Rabbi Yamatze? And the answer is because this is not Lo Yira L'Chasiyar. This Challah doesn't belong to you. Although, as the Gemara is going to point out, you do have certain rights, abstract rights in the Challah. You'll decide which Kohen is going to receive that Challah. But let's say Tovas Hanoinu Momon. I mean, that's the sugya. And therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda, if it's not Lo Yira L'Cha, as we say in Yiddish, what is the problem? Let him just leave it to become chametz, and he doesn't violate any Bali Rabbi Yamatze. It's not his to begin with. You know, it's very paradoxical here because I don't know, Rabbi, you weren't here when we discussed this. The Rishonim and the Shagasari writes a whole siman about this. Ask the following question: what's the problem? Let it be mafkir, and therefore he doesn't violate Bali Rabbi Yamatze. So the Shagasari is famous for answering. I'll just review what we said at the beginning of the Shia. That you can't be mafkir something that's not yours. Because you already were mafresh challah, and it doesn't belong to you. And he claims that even if I hold tovas hanoah mamon, it's not enough that would allow me to be mavatal lechametz, and if I'd be violating by Rabbi Yamatze. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, Adara pumfaker, you're telling me why you can't implement and employ the method of hefker. I'm telling you, that's why you don't need to be mafkir. You can't be mafkir, it says the Shagasari, because it's not yours. Well, says the Rabbi Yehuda, let's turn around and call a spade a spade. If it's not yours, you don't violate by Rabbi Yamatze. Because the Torah says, L'cha iyataroa, avla taroa shalacherim. And here, there's a whole literature to try to explain why the original Tanoim, Rabbi Lezer and Ben Beseira, did not agree. I mean, they were looking urgently to bake this challah so that you avoid Bali Rabbi Yamatze. Apparently, they held that there is Bali Rabbi Yamatze even on challah. Okay, that's going to be the sugya. Now, I want to mention a few issues here that are that already come up on the Mishnah, in the study of the Mishnah. First of all, we have a principle called Chametz Shel Yisrael, HaMufkad Biad Yisrael. That's a sugya on Daf Hey Amid Beis in the first paragraph. And the Gemara comes to the conclusion, again, there's a big machlokes Rishonim. There's Reuven owns the chametz, and now it's in the possession of Shimon. So there's gigantic machlokas Rishonim where the Shimon accepted achrayus, and what level of achrayus did he accept? But in the barest minimum, if he's holding on, meaning Shimon, to Reuven's chametz in a way that he has to return that chametz to Reuven, then he violates Bal Yirah B'Yamatze. And given that premise, or that conclusion, I should say, from the Gemara in the first parak, the Rishonim want to know here, and the one who wrote a whole essay about this is the Pnei Yoshua, is why don't we consider this chametz, which he was mafresh as challah, in other words, challah from the dough, and then it became chametz, as chemshel shel kohen hamufkad biyad Yisrael. Meaning, the Yisrael is responsible when he gets the time and the opportunity to fork over this challah to a Kohen. And in effect, he's holding on not to his own chametz, because he doesn't own the chametz, says Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yeshua. I keep saying Rabbi Yehuda. I meant Rabbi Yeshua. But he nevertheless violates Bal Yirah B'Yimotze on someone else's chametz, because the Gemara in the first parak says, "Lecha shelcha iatoroa, aval toroa shel acherim," which means shel aku, or v'shel gavoa means hegdish, to the exclusion of chametz shel Yisrael. So Reuven wants to deposit his chametz in the hands of Shimon, who's now some level of basic responsibility. He's morally responsible. Maybe he, or even went as far as to accept achrayus on the chametz. He's going to have to return the chametz to Reuven. And Shimon, who's now holding on to Reuven's chametz, is included in the Isur of Bal Yirah B'Yimotze. Comes along the Pnei Yoshua, and he says the following. Even if I hold like those Rishonim, Shaf al Pishalo Kibul of Achrayus, nevertheless he violates Bal Yirah B'Yimotze, and it's only the Chametz Shel Goy. That's where it's mufka from Bal Yirah B'Yimotze. B'chotz Yisrael over Afim Lo Kibul Achrayus. Says the Pnei Yoshua, Kevon Shadayin Lo Basa Hachala Liyad HaKohen, the Lo Zochaba. It's not considered chemto shel Kohen. Again, I'm not sure, but I think what the Pnei Yeshua might be saying is that there's something called Mammon HaShevet. At this point, there's no designated Kohen that can claim ownership on this chametz. He was mafresh chala, it became chametz. What do you mean chemto shel Yisrael acher? Which Yisrael? Joe Cohen, maybe it's Larry the Cohen. I don't know which Cohen. So the challah now belongs to the entire shevet. And that's what we're going to see, that Rabbi Yeshua is maintaining this position that there's no Bal Yirah B'Yimotze over challah because it belongs to the entire shevet. It's not yours. You may have Tovas Hanot to give it to the Cohen of your first choice, but you don't own in a full private ownership. You don't own the challah as Yisrael. You may have rights in the challah that, you could sell those rights in an open market. I'd love to be the one to give the challah to the Kohen. I'll pay for your challah so I can give it to the Kohen. But nevertheless, it's not bailus because it really belongs to Shevet Kahuna. Now we're saying even more than that. Not only does this challah not belong to you, I've used a few different negatives there, but even the Kohen, who will eventually receive the challah, it doesn't even belong to him. Because right now it's lo bal liyad Kohen. So if I have chametz, which is challah, if I give it to the Kohen, and then he deposits it back in my rishus, and I have to give it back to him, then I violate Bal Yirah B'Yimotze for holding on to the Kohen's chametz. But if I was mafresh challah and it became chametz, and I haven't yet delivered it to the Kohen, then it doesn't belong to the Kohen. So it's not that it went into the Kohen's rishus and now he deposited it in my rishus, and therefore there's no Bal Yirah B'Yimotze. Next, would Rabbi Yeshua accept Ben Beseira? And the answer is theoretically yes. Take the dough and put it in the freezer. But there's no necessity to do so. Rabbi Yeshua sover ki ben Beseira, but Ledaito, according to his opinion, it's not necessary to go through the whole hassle of freezing the dough. Ucholek al Rabbi Eliezer, he has a conceptual issue with Rabbi Eliezer. As we said before, the afiyah itself is problematic, and therefore Rabbi Yeshua wants to completely circumvent the afiyah, let the dough rise till zayin gesund, and it becomes chametz, but there's no Bal Yirah B'Yimotze. And according to Rabbi Yeshua, Kevan Sha'omed Lafrosha Achas Mehen, right, as we said before in the Meiri, the way that the Hafrosha could have operated is that one full kikar would be designated for Chala, and therefore the Afiyah is Shalol Tzarch Yontif. But Nechlak al Rabbi Eliezer, V'al Ben B'Seiro, Le'inyan Bal Yirah B'Yimotz. So again, there are two different issues here. You might call three issues, but the third issue is very technical. The two fundamental issues are, can he obviate the problem of Afil Shalol Tzarch Ochel Nefesh by delaying the Afrasha? And one Shita, which is both Ben Beseira and Rabbi Yeshua ganging up against Rabbi Eliezer, is that that's not a solution, because eventually one of those kikros is or could be designated as Chala, and then you did an Afir Shalol Tzarech. That's one fundamental issue. And now we have another fundamental issue. Is there Bal Yirah B'Yimotze on Chala? And in this context, Rabbi Eliezer rejects both, scratch that. Rabbi Yoshua rejects both Rabbi Eliezer and Ben Beseira, because they hold that you have an issue of Bal Yirah B'Yimotze, and Rabbi Yeshua says there's no issue of Bal Yirah B'Yimotze. You might suggest a third issue, as I said, that's very technical. Do we rely on this recommendation that the people will know how to freeze the challah and avoid chimus? So therefore, Rabbi Yeshua advocates that you leave the challah as is, as an isa, and let it become chametz. He doesn't violate any isa at all, because it's not his dough. It's Kohen has dough, but not the Yisrael, the Bailam. Okay. And now the Gemara says, Lema betovas hanoah kamifligi. Shall we assume that the machlokas between Rabbi Yeshua on one side and Rabbi Eliezer and Ben Beseira on the other is about tovas hanoah? The Rabbi Eliezer, I don't know why the Gemara specifies Rabbi Eliezer, because Ben Beseira is on the same page as Rabbi Eliezer. We got to avoid chimutz over here. Tovas hanoah mama. There is a violation of Bal Yirah B'Yimotze on this challah once it becomes chametz, because it is shalcha. What do you mean it's shalcha? You have to give it to the Kohen. But the answer is you have tovas hanoah. And tovas hanoah, which means you decide which Kohen you want to deliver the challah to, that's worth something. And therefore you have benefits and monetary ownership rights in the challah. So therefore we have to bake the challah before it becomes challah, which means, according to Rabbi Eliezer, before you are mafresh challah, you have to bake. Rabbi Yeshua savar tovas hanoah eino momo. The fact that you have rights, abstract rights, to decide to which Kohen you want to deliver this challah, that doesn't give you ownership rights in the gufo shel challah. The challah itself is not yours. You have zchuyot, you have rights vis-a-vis the challah, but the gufo shel challah is not yours. That's Rabbi Yeshua's point. Now, in the next line of the Gemara is saying, "Lo de kuli alma savri tovas hanoah eino mom," and the Gemara is going to try to reinterpret the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. Why is Rabbi Eliezer opposed to allowing the process of chibutz to take place on its own? You know, a non-intervention policy. Why not? I mean, if tovas hanoah ain't no moment, and the Gemara is going to now look for another explanation of Rabbi Eliezer. But before we get to that, I just want to point out that the Rishonim say that we shouldn't misunderstand this Gemara. That when the Gemara is going to say Kuli Alma Tovas Hanoah Eino Mammon, the Gemara is now moved by its agenda that nobody holds Tovas Hana as mom. Kuli Alma, Tovas Hana ain't a mom. That's not true. That's not how we should be reading this Gemara. Because in fact, Tovas Hana Momon or Tovas Hana ain't a mom. It is a gigantic machlokas Tanoim. And there are Tanoim who certainly are committed to the position that Tovas Hana Momon. Now, there's another problem here in this sugya, and this problem is raised by none other than the Rashash. He wants to understand how would Tovas Hana Mamon be meaningful here. The Gemara wants to say that the reason why, according to Rabbi Eliezer, there's a problem of chimutz is because you violate by your Rabbi Motzei. If Tovas Hana is Mamon, it's shalcha because you decide which coin to give. Says Rashash, I don't understand. You're talking about chametz. Chametz is aser ba'ana, and Isuri Hana not called Mamon. You can yell and scream at the top of your lungs from now till doomsday. Well, I have Tovas Hana, and therefore it's mine. Yeah, you have Tovas Hana in regular challah, but not in the case of challah that's aser ba'ana. Challah that's aser ba'ana is eino Mamon. You're not allowed to benefit at all from this challah. So that Tovas Hana Mamon means I can sell on the open market my rights to choose my favorite Kohen. So you want to choose the Kohen, you want to be the good guy, you want this Kohen to owe you a favor because you supplied him with a beautiful kikar and you sent it home for him, for his Pesach celebration, and you're willing to pay me. How much will you pay me? Obviously not the value of the kikar, but you'll pay me a pruta at least. And therefore, Tovas Hana Mamon, if I could sell my rights to give to the Kohen on the open market, that's worth something. But in chametz, that's not true. I can't sell this chametz on the market, not even for the purpose of choosing which Kohen, because that too would be benefiting from the chametz. So I can't get a penny from this chametz. I'm enjoined from selling this chametz even for a minimum of a pruta. Says the Rashash, Keiron shel inyan bal yirah b'yimotzei, asa akasav es hachametz keilu bershuso, which I'll try to explain, is gamli yinzeh roem keilu hi muteres b'ana, the over mishum bal yirah b'yimotzei. Chametz is Isurei Hana. The whole enterprise of Bal Yirah B'Yimotzei with regard to chametz makes no sense. You have two principles that are mutually exclusive. One principle says you only violate Bal Yirah B'Yimotzei if it's yours. If it's not yours, there's no Bal Yirah B'Yimotzei. There's another principle that says that Isurei Hana ain't a mama. That you don't have ownership on something that's not yours. So the one who comes up with a solution to this problem is Rabbi Yishmael back in the first Perek Vav, and he says, "Shnei dvarim eino b'shusa shel adam, v'asa not kosev kilu ein b'shusa." So the Isur Hana of chametz, which universally in terms of all of halacha kol tarkula removes my bilus, will not remove my bilus vis-a-vis Bal Yirah B'Yimotzei. Rav Soloveitchik has tons of shiurim on this very topic. But in any event, the bottom line is the Gemara establishes that forget about Isuri Hana, it's chametz, it's in your rishus, and you have rights to this chametz. Let me just see if we have anything else here that I wanted to add to this to the Rashash. That Imlu Rabbi Lezbechal Torkula Tovas Hana Mamon. Okay, that's a whole nother discussion. Vada, he says in the name of Ram Chalva that Yesh Tanoim Asovim Shetovus Hanon Momon, Ein Kavodas Hagmor Lomar She'ein Dea Hasoveres came, Elo Kavanosa She'ein Hechrech Lomar Shebezeh Nechleku Rabbi Eliezer of Yoshua. Now, the Gemara is going to introduce a new principle of Hoel, which Yirtzeh Hashem, B'Lineda will cover tomorrow. And I just want to give you one piece of background information so that you can appreciate the next sugya, which we'll cover tomorrow. And that is that we consider Hafrashas Truma and Chala as a neder, comes under the Parashim Nedarim. And therefore, the halacha is that you could be shoel a chacham, and a chacham could be materit. And that's true for any kind of hegdish and truma and chala in this case. We have a din of neder, and therefore it's possible that he might be shoel on his neder and completely undermine the status of this this chala. So it's Shem. That we'll cover tomorrow. Okay, then that's where we'll end the shir for today.